You, Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, most welcome guests and newest members. And congratulations, Kyle, on your conclusion of your journey. Now, I sometimes engage in a little bit of hyperbole, as in the title. Now, everything you know isn't wrong, but many of the things that you do are. In the first version of this speech, I had some items that actually I thought maybe people didn't know were wrong, but actually people did know. For example, how long do you have to wait before going swimming after you eat?
10 minutes.
Are you
0
asking?
minutes. How much of our brain do we use? 10%? 90%. Neuroscientists have proven that. But I'm not going to talk about those because everybody knows that. Or at least you do now. I'm going to talk about three things. Things that we might believe about our champions, the people who we emulate, such as George Washington. And things that we more or less take for granted, such as being part of the United States, where we sit today. And why did Reconstruction end? Let's start with George Washington. Everybody knows that George Washington had a lot of problems with his teeth from an early age. And he had dentures, in fact. And what were they made of? Wrong. They were made of ivory, metal, and most icky, human teeth. In fact, probably the teeth of slaves. So when George Washington gave his inaugural address, he was speaking with the teeth of slaves that he probably owned. These are one of George Washington's dentures. Again, ivory and human teeth. Now, at the time, of course, slavery was a thing. And we all know that slavery was confined to the southernmost colonies exclusively, right? No, every single colony had slavery at one point in its time. However, the northern colonies typically excluded it. Now, George Washington, he didn't like slavery. He disliked slavery so much that at the end of his life he owned over 300 slaves. And in fact, in Pennsylvania, they passed a law that said that any slave which lived continuously in Pennsylvania for 6 months would become free. George Washington spent time in Philadelphia, as you know. Did you know that none of his slaves were ever freed by that? Because before the 6 months were up, he would take them back to Mount Vernon in Virginia. And then when they came back, the clock would start again. That's how much he hated slavery. Let's move on to why is California part of the United States? Or why is Texas part of the United States, for that matter? Now, in the 1840s, this was Mexico. So what happened? Well, you've heard a lot about immigration and how terrible that is. And actually, there's a good point to that. Because in the Texas region, there was a lot of immigration, but not from Mexicans, because they were the citizens. The immigration was from Americans who moved into Texas. And at some point, there were so many of them that they decided to have a little revolution against Mexico and basically declare Texas a separate part. Now, you've all heard about Manifest Destiny as being this wonderful thing. Well, it was so wonderful that the United States decided, well, you know, Texas, they've got a good thing going. So let's invade Mexico and take all of this stuff, including California. So when they say to people of Mexican heritage, go back to Mexico, they could just as easily say to us, well, why don't you go back to America and give us Mexico back? Now, my final question is, you all have learned about Reconstruction followed the Civil War. How did that end? And did that have anything to do with a presidential election? In fact, you may think that the 2016 election and the 2000 election by George W. Bush and Donald Trump were the only ones in which someone with a popular vote actually lost to the other person. Well, in 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes, there he is, lost the popular vote to Samuel Tilden, a Democrat. But the problem was in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, the electoral votes were disputed. There were 20 electoral votes and nobody had a majority. So they formed a special electoral commission to decide which of the two would get the electoral votes. Now the deal that they made was the Democrats agreed to allow Hayes, the Republican, to become the president if they would withdraw the federal troops in the South who were enforcing the equality there. And so because of that deal, Hayes, who had actually lost the popular vote and probably would have lost the electoral vote, but not for this deal, withdrew the federal troops, and within a very short time, the Jim Crow laws, which you all know about, were enacted. So that's how Reconstruction actually ended. So things that you may think you know about George Washington, about why we're here, and about how Reconstruction ended, may or may not be true. I challenge you to think about what you think is true, what you may have been taught, and question whether or not that in fact is true. These are my sources for what I presented today. And remember, history may be written sometimes by the champions, but in some cases, it's written by the losers. Mr. Toastmaster.